Saturday's newscast has no Laura, but it does have Henry Zeffman, fresh from his Starmer's Stormy year doc.
That's right. Available now on BBC Sounds, available on BBC Radio 4 at 11 a.m. on Monday. And what timing? What timing?
It coincided with a third U-turn.
That's right. Which has, I think, left Keir Starmer ending his first year in a more vulnerable place than he's ever been before. And you've been doing U-turns, I believe, Paddy, this morning.
Yes, for the purposes of BH on Sunday, I've been in an HGV learning how to do the correct U-turn.
Is it easier to do one or harder to do one in an HGV compared to a car?
It's harder because the end of the trailer, the wheels scrape sideways. So there's always collateral damage from a U-turn. The advice is signal it clearly, use it as a last resort, and be aware that turning left or right can also be a course correction rather than a U-turn.
Well, having failed my driving test 4 times before I passed, I'm pleased that I made a documentary rather than doing... I think we're in the right jobs each here.
Well, let's get underway mixing the two on Saturday's newscast. Hello, it's Paddy in the studio.
And it's Henry in the studio.
What was it like in Westminster when this moment was obviously happening in the middle of the night?
Well, I have this weird job, as you know, Paddy, a brilliant job to be clear, but it involves me waking up very early in the morning. And therefore, sometimes if I'm well behaved, I go to bed a bit early at night. So I went to bed on Monday night. I'd just seen, I think, the first reports of this reasoned amendment, which does not do it justice, wrecking amendment, coming out. And I remember thinking, gosh, that seems really quite bad for the government. But then I woke up at 4:15 in the morning, looked at my phone, and I remember in my journey into work, and I was stationed in Downing Street that morning for BBC Breakfast, thinking, gosh, I really think they might be in sort of fatal trouble when it comes to this issue here. And it took me sort of more and more of the morning to process. So I think if you watch back what I said on BBC Breakfast, I think at 6 I said this is very bad for them. At 7 I said, actually, this is really quite bad. I think by 9 I was saying, this is the most serious crisis that Keir Starmer's premiership has faced yet. And so it has proved. It has been an astonishingly bad week for Keir Starmer and his government.
And what's happened to the amendment? Has Meg Hillier withdrawn it?
I don't think she has formally yet, but we are expecting her to. That's not to say, though, that the government is completely out of the woods when it comes to the vote or a series of votes on Tuesday. I think there are still some, and we don't know quite how many Labour MPs, determined to continue to display their opposition to the government on this issue.
Because I suppose what I heard from Alex Sobel, one of those late signers to the amendment on Newsnight, is that the changes, excluding existing claimants from tighter PIP restrictions, would effectively create what they call two-tier welfare. And it reminds you of kind of what Labour MPs are. They are state support, they are redistribution, and they are on the spectrum of the left.
I mean, lots of us have been saying, Paddy, for months, that however changed, as Keir Starmer likes to call it, the Labour Party might be under his leadership, if Labour MPs across whatever faction they belong to have an irreducible core, it is this. It's support for a generous welfare state. And you fiddle around with that as a Labour leader at your peril, as various prime ministers of a Labour hue have learned, including Tony Blair, who suffered a big rebellion on welfare policies in his first year as Prime Minister. Crucial difference, though, Tony Blair was still very popular with the public at the time, and he still won the vote comfortably without having to change course. Keir Starmer is in a very different position indeed.
And, of course, there's another big difference with 1997, 8 and 9, which is that the disability benefits in the welfare budget have ballooned, such that the welfare component of health spending is the size of the defence budget. Everyone says we've got to tackle the welfare dilemma, including the rebels who don't want it done this way.
Well, I mean, if someone were from the government were here and able to speak candidly, they would say, yeah, it's very easy for the welfare rebels to say, oh, of course we support the principle of reform, but not like that. They would say, well, hang on, where are their alternative ideas? Their alternative ideas all seem to involve spending money on supporting people into work, but not actually cutting money from the overall budget. And we should remember, by the way, the government's proposals, now junked or at least curtailed significantly, were not for a cut in the amount of money that the government is spending on welfare. They were to slow the rate of increase, at least projected increase, to the amount of money the government would be spending on welfare. So I think that's quite an important point to reflect. But what we are talking about, what this reflects, is the way in which the government ended up mashing together two issues with absolutely devastating political effect for them, because there are two different things. One is how many people are now out of work, how many people are on disability benefits, etc., how you might be able to help people back into work, how you might be able to help people be healthier. The other is that the Treasury needed to save money. And it's the combination of the two at the same time which made so many Labour MPs so angry.
You had been working on this documentary, Starmer's Stormy Year, and the Stormy Year includes Freebiegate. It includes the domination of the winter fuel cut, which was then later reversed, dominating life before the budget, and also the departure of Sue Gray as the Chief of Staff, the criticism now that's come from Morgan McSweeney as the Chief of Staff. So we can pivot, which is the political word, isn't it, from this current stramash. And we must return to the fact what will happen on Tuesday. We must return to that during the podcast. We can pivot to what you learnt when you broke apart Downing Street's political management skills, which appear to be in the dock time and time again during the 12 months.
Yeah, and I think, look, I can't pretend that I always anticipated that the end of the year and the end of my Radio 4 documentary would be a massive rebellion on welfare. The Prime Minister didn't see it coming. The Labour whips were jumping up and down, shouting to the Prime Minister that there was going to be a bigger rebellion than they thought, but they didn't see the reasoned amendment coming, and they didn't see the numbers being what they were. So, of course, nor did I. But I do actually think that the seeds of what has happened to Keir Starmer this week were sown over the past year and beforehand. Because I think one of the big questions that I keep coming back to in the programme, and that I kept hearing from the people I interviewed, is, was this government ready? Was the Labour Party ready for government? And I don't think you will find many people who will give you a sort of full-throated yes.
Because it did look different, didn't it? They came in with an ambitious King's speech.
They did. Certainly an extensive King's speech. But I think I remember, Paddy, actually both around the country, when I was travelling the country during the general election, and speaking to civil servants and others around government and in government, in the run-up to the general election, they would say to me, well, look, of course, Keir Starmer's election platform has to be quite careful and he can't tell us everything that he'll do. But we all know, of course, that actually they have many more plans. And when they come into government, they'll do this and they'll do that. And it just wasn't true, actually. Labour's cautious election campaign, and it might well have been cautious for very good reason. Pat McFadden tells me for my documentary, Pat McFadden, who ran the general election campaign, says, look, I had one job and it was to win. And his predecessors for 4 successive general elections had not won. But I think that caution of the campaign resulted in, or reflected, perhaps both, a sort of slight lack of thinking. And I say lack of thinking because that is what Simon Case, who until recently was the head of the civil service, told me. And perhaps we can have a listen to that now.
There were some elements where not enough thinking had been done. There were some areas where sitting in the centre of government, early in a new regime, the Prime Minister and his team, and including me as his sort of core team, knew what we wanted to do, but we weren't communicating that effectively across all of government. Government is hundreds of thousands of people. You include the NHS and it's millions of people. To get things done, you have to communicate. This is what we're doing. This is the direction. And definitely, I would say early on, we weren't good enough at communicating what wanted to be done and what needed to be done to everybody.
I mean, that's quite Sir Humphrey-ish in its phrasing, but it's pretty damning.
Yeah, no, I'm really not getting Sir Humphrey. Sir Humphrey would have said, well, it's a challenging environment for brave decisions. And actually, he's saying we didn't communicate well. It was quite disorganised.
Right, and Sir Humphrey, I should say, of course, we're talking about Sir Humphrey Applebee, the head of the Civil Service and Cabinet Secretary in Yes, Prime Minister. I mean, I think that lack of thinking, we should reflect, as Simon Case actually does in an interview with me as well. This was probably the most challenging inheritance, domestically and globally, for any Prime Minister since Clement Attlee became Prime Minister after the end of the Second World War. And any Prime Minister of any party would have struggled with that. But that's what made it, I think, even more important for this government to hit the ground running. And they just didn't manage that. And I think, you talk about an extensive King's speech, it's true. But in so many crucial areas of policy, as well as promising to legislate at some point in the first session, the government commissioned reviews, it commissioned reports, commissions, whatever it may have been. And I think that meant that those policies which they did announce stood out all the more. And that, I think, explains the political sensitivity of the first welfare cut of the year, which was, of course, the means testing of the winter fuel allowance.
So we will hear from Pat McFadden, who talks to you about how surprise was created by that one. But we have newscasters who talk about their life and what the policy is, and sometimes accuse us of doing the process and not the policy, and that the journalists who cover Westminster and the broadcasters are obsessed with U-turns, with political rivalries. But actually what happens is people behind the front doors in constituencies are trying to live. And this is what's come into our inbox from newscaster Steve. He receives PIP, that's the personal independence payment, because of chronic back pain from an injury. Why do politicians always pick on the disabled? I thought that was the Tories' stunt, not Labour. The rebellion shows there are still some decent MPs saying that this will hurt people, but despite the U-turn, the government's already shown their hand.
And I think that reflects why so many Labour MPs were so furious with the government and were prepared to defy the government. It's not just that they feel so passionately about a generous welfare state, especially for the disabled, though, of course, many of those rebels do. It's also, you've got to remember the life of an MP. They spend 3.5 or 4 days of their week in Westminster obsessing like we do about U-turns and about the political position of the Prime Minister and so on. And then they hold their constituency surgeries and they hear from people like Steve, who are often very anxious, especially, I'm told they have been anxious in the last few months, many people at constituency surgeries, because they fear that they are going to lose money in a big way. And of course, that would affect their lives.
So another newscaster called Steve, and if you're a newscaster and you're not called Steve, just a shout out to you. In all the reports leading up to the U-turn, there wasn't much discussion of the role of the whips. It would be good to hear your thoughts and some analysis of why the PM didn't see this coming until so late.
Well, look, as I said, the whips were trying to say for months to the Prime Minister and his inner team, look, this rebellion is going to be bigger than you think. There is real anxiety. Though I don't think anyone is claiming that they were saying, look, Meg Hillier is going to table a reasoned amendment and it's going to have 120 Labour signatories within a couple of days. That surprised them. But it does seem to reflect, or in the last few days it has come to be seen to reflect, a remoteness on the part of Keir Starmer.
Bearing in mind he'd already ditched Sue Gray because she was seen as not having political antennae, and then replaced with Morgan McSweeney, who was in a tug of war with her anyway.
Political antennae and parliamentary handling are not necessarily the same thing, and that's an interesting point. Morgan McSweeney is not a creature of Parliament. He's a creature of the local and then national Labour Party. That's a different thing. He spends his time thinking about how Keir Starmer can appeal to the general public. And we should say, by the way, that the polling is mixed and complex, but generally governments have found in their research and political parties have found in their research that the public support the idea that welfare is too generous and support, at least in the abstract, the idea of cutting it.
Everyone's getting at what you're getting at, except the Labour MPs were angry that this has come in the way it's come, front-loaded. It's not like we've got a plan to make this happen in 5 years. It's let's take it away now. And that's the same with winter fuel. So you're saying the whips were warning, they were sending warning to the cockpit, but the cockpit wasn't reading the flashing warning light. So that takes us back to Pat McFadden, who you spoke to, who ran the election campaign, is a very seasoned parliamentarian and Labour Party member. In fact, he travelled around with Tony Blair during the 1990s.
He was Blair's link man with the trade unions and with Parliament when Tony Blair was first Prime Minister.
So what did he say to you in Starmer's Stormy year, available on BBC Sounds, about the winter fuel fiasco?
Well, we were talking, I think that interview was literally the day or 2 days after the government had finally completed its winter fuel U-turn. And I asked him why they had done so, and this is what he had to say.
I think the reaction to it since the decision was announced was probably stronger than we thought, and that it became this leitmotif or this real symbol, and that politics can be like that. You can spend an awful lot of money over here doing something and it doesn't get noticed as much, and you can save $1.5 billion from changes to winter fuel and it gets noticed an awful lot. And people, let us know about that pretty loudly and clearly over the past 10, 11 months.
Now, you might be listening to that and thinking, yeah, well, duh, of course they dropped it because it was unpopular. But actually, if you remember the interviews that were being done around the time of them having dropped the policy by Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves said, well, this is the benefit of a stabilising economy. So it was actually quite candid of Pat McFadden to not bother with any of that to me and just admit, yes, it was less popular than they thought. I mean, actually, speaking to people who'd been involved in the decision-making about that in the course of making this documentary, and they were saying it wasn't just that the government found it to be more unpopular than they thought it would be. They thought it would be popular. They thought that Rachel Reeves's kind of radical frankness about the state of the economy they had inherited and her willingness to grasp nettles in response would be embraced by the public. And I think there's a world in which if it had come at the same time as the rest of the budget, perhaps, if it had come at the same time that the government had raised taxes on business to fund improvements in public services and so on, I think perhaps it would have been significantly less unpopular. But we are where we are.
Also, there's this business of things can only get worse. And the Prime Minister gave an interview to the Observer's Tom Baldwin, who's also his biographer. And I spoke to him on PM on Friday, in which he said Keir Starmer now regrets saying things can only get worse. He's told Tom Baldwin he regrets that. He's told Tom Baldwin he regrets his speech, "We're going to become an island of strangers," saying that he did not know that that was aping a line from Enoch Powell's divisive speech. He didn't know that that was going to rake those ghosts up. So he has admitted to Tom Baldwin that he's made mistakes in the year gone by.
I think there are a few other regrets as well. I think he said he regretted not having properly read that speech, let alone what it said before he gave it. I think he said he regretted becoming too emotionally invested in the sort of gifts and hospitality period, freebie gate as it came to be known. I mean, it's kind of reverse Edith Piaf. Je regrette everything.
Yeah.
I can't remember what the French for everything is. Apologies to my French GCSE teacher, Ms. Walker.
It's two.
Je regrette tous les choses.
Yes,
or something like that. Anyway, but as you say, I mean, that Rose Garden speech where he said things will get worse before they get better. I mean, that was, by the way, a month after the winter fuel announcement. He gave that Rose Garden speech at the end of August. So the winter fuel cuts have been announced. Everyone's gone away for the summer. Then during the summer, I mean, actually, the horrific attack by Axel Rudder-Cabana in Southport was on the same day as Rachel Reeves announced the winter fuel cut. Rachel Reeves, if you watch back her statement in the House of Commons, she stands up and begins it by saying, "I know the thoughts of the whole House will be with those in Southport as we learn more of what appears to be an awful incident this morning." So it's a grim summer to be in Britain. And the Prime Minister begins the new parliamentary term by saying, yeah, and it's going to get worse. Yeah. And I think politically what they were trying to do, I know this because they were telling me it at the time, they thought that David Cameron and George Osborne back in 2010 had won the 2015 election in the first weeks after the 2010 general election because they'd absolutely nailed the argument that what they'd inherited was worse than what they thought. I think what nobody really appreciated in Westminster, and I include journalists in this actually at the time, was that you couldn't do the same thing because in 2010 people had had maybe 18 months of suffering and difficulty and feeling like, things were not as great to be in Britain as they had been before. But by 2024, it had been a much longer period of people feeling like they were a bit beaten down. And actually they did, it turns out, want a bit of hope.
So that's done, that issue, and the Prime Minister says he's good at learning, so we can expect, one thing we haven't spoken about is how he'll change, and I think we can probably expect to hear more hope being signalled from Downing Street, if I read it correctly, if I understand what this biographer is saying and you're saying. But we can't really move on without picking up on what happened after the Southport attacks, which was riots. And the reaction was very swift, and although it seemed it was going the government's way, there soon became the two-tier Keir criticism, which you've put to the Attorney General as part of this documentary. And do they accept that some justice was meted out quicker to some kinds of people than other, or do they not accept that?
No, they don't accept it at all. Certainly Lord Hermer, who's the Attorney General, and this is the first time he's ever given a broadcast interview, so I was very pleased to have that, and it's in the programme. He absolutely does not accept that at all. I asked him what his response was to the two-tier comparisons, and this is what he had to say.
What some people were seeking to do, bringing up two-tier, was to make a comparison with the way that people were being treated for trying to kill police officers, and I want to reiterate that, kill police officers, with the response to protests on the street of London, and you can have views as to whether they're right protest or wrong protest, but they were not producing violence that you could even begin legitimately to compare to see what was going on the riots. So that's where the two-tier comes from. It's frankly disgusting to start to draw those type of comparisons.
Interesting to think that the two-tier has come back, although it's not linked to his name, because it's coming from Labour MPs saying, in this change, if you treat future claimants different from existing claimants, you then do have a sort of two-tier welfare system. So it's a strange thing about the vocabulary of politics that this phrase could come back in this way.
Yeah, and just to bring the conversation full circle, that is why I think there's still going to be a sizable, though probably not politically successful, rebellion on Tuesday from Labour MPs, because some of them are still saying, well, hang on a second, I oppose the original plans because I think they are insufficiently generous to disabled people, and I feel exactly the same way about future disabled people and their treatment as I do current disabled people.
And also, just not to leave it hanging, the Attorney General says that to say two-tier Keir about the Southport riots reaction is disgusting, doesn't comprehend the situation correctly, what the violence was. So it's a reminder for me of what's been happening every day with Newscast, this extraordinary news cycle. The Prime Minister can rightly say he inherited a very difficult set of circumstances. He can rightly say things happened in the country that we had not witnessed for a long time. And also, then they happened in the world.
Yeah, and we should say, this documentary really is not just 42 minutes of everything Keir Starmer's got wrong. There is an awful lot in there about how deftly he has handled the international situation, in particular his handling of President Trump. But actually, I think it's easy to forget that he handled his first several months on the world stage when Joe Biden was still president pretty well. And one of the great guests we have on the programme is Jake Sullivan, who was Joe Biden's national security advisor, and he talks about how impressive Keir Starmer was. He says it's not easy to be a new world leader and instantly go to a big summit. It was the NATO summit he went to within his first week in Washington, D.C., and look and sound and be the part. And he says that Keir Starmer was. So I think, we should reflect that one reason perhaps that Keir Starmer has felt a bit remote, for example, to Labour MPs who are so angry about welfare, is because he has been, of necessity, spending a lot of time either outside of the UK or in the UK, but on the blower to world leaders, because that's what the UK Prime Minister needs to do.
One of the things I think we should go out on is this feeling that things have changed, so they can change again. And you can't rule out, can you, that they do get their act together as a political operation. They've admitted that they did not. So you can't rule out that the Labour government improves in the eyes of its MPs. Absolutely.
And you said earlier that Keir Starmer learns from his mistakes. And one of the things that a lot of people said to me for my programme is variations on the theme of Keir Starmer is, if he's one thing, he's a fast learner. Politics doesn't necessarily come naturally to him, but working hard, analysing what he's done wrong and mopping it up does come quite naturally to him.
But he's got to land a tax rise, according to a lot of independent observers. I spoke to Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. He said the U-turn has cost $3 billion. It was meant to save 5, so it's actually cost 3. So it's down to 2, the savings. And you've got to predict tax rises if you want to be a sensible someone who understands adding up.
Look, I don't know if Labour MPs in signing this amendment quite knew that what they were doing was asserting that they wanted tax rises, but that is inescapably the effect of it. Let's be real. And it's going to be very interesting, and I don't think we've said her name much during this podcast, to see how Rachel Reeves handles that in the run-up to this autumn. Look, the invective being sprayed around SW1 adjacent WhatsApps about Rachel Reeves at the moment is quite extraordinary. Keir Starmer is ruthless. As well as being a fast learner, Keir Starmer is ruthless. And I just would leave you with the thought that it is not impossible, as we end this first year, it really is not, that it is not Rachel Reeves who delivers this government's second budget.
A very big thought to go out on, a big week. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.
Goodbye.